Welcome to all the participants. We're excited today to have this webinar be the kickoff of a great discussion about a further explanation into the economic impacts of farm-to-school programming. And we're so glad that you all chose to join us today to be a part of the start of this discussion. I think we have a rich set of speakers, so I want to just welcome you for now. I am Dawn Thilmany from Colorado State University, and I will be kicking us off today. Next slide. First, we want to make sure to acknowledge all of the great partners that made the work you're going to hear about today happen. Besides the presenters, which you are going to be hearing from and their organizations, we've also got lots of great support from several partners to make this project happen, including the USDA, CoBank, AgriBank, and Colorado State University Extension, who is hosting the webinar today. Next slide. You're going to hear from all of the people that you see on the screen today, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But let me just quickly relay to you that we really hope that the point of this webinar is to take that theme of farm to school, strengthening the connection between our communities and our local food producers, and start highlighting some really specific work that's being done, partly under a longer term projects on the economics of local food systems and the Toolkit guide that the USDA Ag Marketing Service sponsored to put together. But even more specifically, Cornell has a new practitioner's guide to really dig deep into how you look at the economic impacts of some of these projects. So we're taking two relatively new tools that you'll hear about today and applying them to a really important and continually visible topic, which is farm to school, and looking at what we've been able to do with that organization to apply some of those tools to look at what's going on nationally with farm to school programming. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who's going to look at the role of economic impact assessments in supporting farm to school initiatives. And Anupana Joshi is going to speak from this point forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Hi, everybody. My name is Anupama Joshi. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of the National Farm to School Network, and it's a delight to be on this panel today to talk about the economic impacts of farm to school. Next slide, please. So let me start off by just giving you a quick overview of the National Farm to School Network. We are a network that is working at the national level with more than 15,000 members. We have an advisory board that consists of experts and leaders in the field who guide the strategic direction of the organization. We have a small national staff, and most importantly, we have nearly 200 entities that are serving as core and supporting partners for the National Farm to School Network, and these cover all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and the U.S. territories. These partners are based at different entities such as state agencies, nonprofits, university or extension, and other organizations. And the network model really ensures and facilitates that collaboration between various sectors in the state to leverage the capacity of all of these entities. The National Farm to School Network's mission is to increase access to local food and nutrition education, to improve children's health, strengthen family farms, and cultivate vibrant communities. Next slide. A quick overview of what we mean by farm to school. There is no one defined program of farm to school. However, implementation varies by community, and we always include one of these core elements that are part of farm to school. The first one being procurement, local foods being purchased, promoted, or served in the cafeteria or as a snack or taste test. Secondly, education, students participating in educational activities that are related to agriculture, food, health, and nutrition. And third, school gardens, so students engaging in hands-on learning through gardening. These three elements of farm to school, procurement, education, and school gardens, really work together cohesively to give students many opportunities to connect and engage with fresh local food and build healthy habits that can last a lifetime. Farm to School enriches the connection that communities have with fresh, healthy foods by connecting them with local producers and by changing food purchasing and education practices at schools. And I also want to add that the same core elements of Farm to School can be implemented at early care settings or ECE sites as well. And we work on both K-12 and ECE settings. Next slide. The Farm to School model is inherently a cross-sectoral model and has certainly potential influences on various types of outcomes that you see here on this slide. Working clockwise from the top left corner, for example, with regards to public health, we know that Farm to School programs or programming increases fruit and vegetable consumption in children by up to 1.3 servings per day. Also, kids are generally consuming less unhealthy foods and sodas. They're reducing their screen time and increasing physical activity as well. So there's lots of positive outcomes with regards to public health. With regards to education, there are studies that are showing positive outcomes in student engagement and in academic achievement, where children are more knowledgeable and aware about gardening, agriculture, healthy eating, local foods, growing cycles, seasonality, and other STEM concepts. And there are also positive outcomes that are being seen with regards to engagement of educators, school staff, and parents. For example, there are studies that show that Farm to School programming increases food service staff motivation and morale. There's also an increase in knowledge and interest in food service and in educators with regards to local food preparation and seasonal recipes, and an increase in interactions with teachers to strengthen the connection between classroom and cafeteria. There are also some studies, although limited ones, that show positive impacts on the environment by way of reduced food waste, including reduced plate waste, as well as a reduction in transportation-related environmental impacts because of the lesser number of food miles that are happening because of purchase of local food products. Today's webinar is specifically focused on the community economic development impacts, and so we're going to hear a lot more about that today, so I'm not going to cover that. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight for you all a resource that has been created by the National Farm to School Network. This is really a compilation of and a highlighting of emerging research and literature that we are seeing about farm to school outcomes in various sectors that I mentioned. There are certainly more rigorous studies that are needed in all of the sectors, and the work that we are presenting today, or part of the work that we're presenting today, is a step in the right direction with regards to looking at the economic benefits of farm to school. Next slide. The National Farm to School Network frames farm to school as a triple win, because we see it as a win for kids, as a win for farmers, and as a win for communities. And in the literature review that I highlighted on the previous slide, there's certainly a lot more studies that are focused on public health and educational outcomes, and less so on farmer benefits and the potential community economic development impacts of farm to school. We certainly need more rigorous studies, especially in this area of economics and job creation outcomes with farm to school. And we are fortunate to have partnered with the researchers at Colorado State University to conduct an economic impact assessment of farm to school that you're going to hear more about today. And also want to take a moment to thank our supporters, CoBank and AgriBank, for supporting this study. This was much needed to move the research on farm to school. And the work that we've started, I hope, is a way for propelling more rigorous studies in the future in the field, so that farm to school practitioners know what is happening on the ground, is actually, data is being collected on it as well. So with that quick overview and highlighting the need for economic impact assessments of farm to school, I am happy to pass it on to the next presenter for today, Christina Connell of the USDA.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My name is Christina Cannell. I'm a Senior Technical Advisor in USDA's Office of Community Food Systems, and I'm going to give you all kind of a quick overview of what our office does related to farm to school, and then a super quick insight into a little bit of the research that we've done related to farm to school. Next slide, please. So just as Anupama outlined too, we just want to be super clear that when we're talking about farm to school at USDA, we are not only talking about procuring local food, but also that combination of food education and school gardens, whether that be nutrition or agriculture education. We know that these programs are most impactful and likely resonate in the most economic impacts, most health impacts when all three of these components are combined together. Next slide. So at USDA, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act of 2010 authorized and mandated that the Secretary create a farm to school program that does three things. We have a $5 million grant program that we award annually. We provide training and technical assistance to state agencies, school districts, nonprofits, et cetera, related to buying local foods, planning farm to school, all of those topics. And then the third thing that we're really focused on today is to disseminate and do research related to farm to school. So those are the three pillars of our work. Next slide, please. So in that research category, that is basically embodied in two main areas, the farm to school census and then some research related to our grant program. So the farm to school census we have conducted twice, once in 2013 and again in 2015, and we are starting to plan for the next farm to school census, which will likely be in 2019. The graphics that I'm going to focus on today are from the most recent census in 2015, which surveyed schools about their buying and farm to school practices in school year 2013-2014. So while it is a few years past at this point, it's the most recent kind of comprehensive data set that we have. And so it is a census in that we surveyed all 18,000 school districts in the country, and we had a pretty decent response rate of about 70%. And with that information, you can see here that we saw 42% of those respondents said that they're participating in some sort of farm to school activity. So it's really exciting that schools are engaged, whether that is buying local foods and serving them on the menu, or they're doing school gardens or some combination of farm to school activities. Next slide. I should say too, the census showed that $790 million was invested in local foods. So that is that's a pretty big number. We're excited about that. We also know that that was a really big over 100% increase from the 2013 census. So we're seeing these practices increase and more local foods being purchased. Next slide. And you're going to hear, I think, a lot more about this from other folks today with more specifics. But just want to point out that why $790 million was purchased of local foods, that likely represents a much larger investment in local economic activity. So we're excited to see that. I also want to just point out that for folks that don't know, the farm to school census is pretty accessible online. So you can go to that website that's on the slide here, and you can navigate all the way down from the state to an individual school district. So you can kind of play around and compare and contrast states and school districts and see what they're doing related to farm to school. Next slide. The census told us that farm to school is working, right? It's working. Schools aren't just doing it, but they're doing it because they're seeing reduced food waste, lower program costs, increased participation, which I think is a really key one to point out always, in that with more students participating, more products are needed, which is increased economic development. So just to point out that farm to school is happening, and it's creating a positive impact in these districts. Next slide. And then just a few quick numbers about the Farm to School grant program, just so folks have an idea, have a sense. We've had 5 cohorts of grantees so far. We've awarded 365 grants in those 5 years. It's a very competitive program still. On average, about 1 in 5 applications are funded. We've received over $120 million in requests, but have only been able to fund $25 million. So it's competitive, and want to note too that the fiscal year 2018 grant RFA is out right now. Next slide. So also, related to economic development, we're seeing other positive impacts with farm-to-school grantees. Farm-to-school grantees have experienced increased taste tests and cooking demonstrations, increased field trips, increased farm-to-school concepts in curriculum. So all of these things are going to drive interest and participation and excitement about local foods, which will then hopefully drive economic activity past that. Next slide. And if you can just click through, I think they come through one-on-one. And just want to kind of point out, farm to school matters for all these different things. I think we're probably preaching to the choir here a little bit. But farm to school is driving kids to try new foods, increasing consumption of fruits and vegetables, and showing positive economic impacts. Sometimes we kind of, it's like, okay, why am I asking a school district to do one more thing? And just like that other slide about the census shows, we're seeing positive activities happening because of farm to school. So thank you for having me. I just want to point out, USDA obviously supports the work that you all are doing, and I'm excited to dive into the case studies. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. This is Jeff O'Hara. Like Christina, I'm also with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I am in the Agricultural Marketing Service here at USDA. Next slide, please. The Agricultural Marketing Service, where FNS, focuses on nutrition and diets. The mission of the Agricultural Marketing Service is really to create new market opportunities for American products and for American farmers. Next slide, please. So there's different divisions within AMS. The focus of our division here is on local food research and development. So we maintain a series of online local food directories. We undertake research and analysis, and we also provide technical assistance and outreach to producers and farmers in the local food space. And as part of that mission, we have really taken an interest in farm to school. So next slide, please. And Christina has already alluded to in her slides that a term called a multiplier, which we'll talk more about here in a little bit. And that relates to an interest that we have in talking about to what extent are farm to school programs helping the economy. But we also want to promote, to the best extent possible, accurate and defensible ways of measuring local food market and economic activity. And so in order to do that, next slide, please. And so here's just a couple of terms here about that Christina had brought up, and maybe we can talk about the multipliers here. This is about ways in which we're measuring economic impacts. Direct effects are essentially the purchases of local products, by schools, either from farms or distributors. And then the term multiplier comes in is because that leads to subsequent rounds of spending in the economy. Induced effects means that there's increase in labor incomes either by employees or proprietors, either on the farm or the distributor that are selling local products, and then they in turn are going to turn around and spend some money in the local economy, going to doctor's appointments and buying groceries and purchasing gas and so on and so forth. There's also indirect effects from that initial level of purchaser because farms need inputs. They need seeds. They need other kinds of inputs. And so the ratio of the total spending relative to the initial round of spending that Christina had referred to as a multiplier, and that's really what the term is. And next slide, please. But we really wanted to help empower people to understand what those terms were a little bit better. We wanted to communicate these concepts more broadly, and we're really trying to help stakeholders and practitioners around the country get their arms around to what extent, within their community or within their region, are local food programs leading to economic outcomes. And so to do that, we initiated a cooperative agreement, which is led by Colorado State University, to create what we call a toolkit. And the toolkit is essentially a best practices guide on assisting communities and stakeholders and walking them through how to measure the economic effects of a local food initiative. It's maintained on a website, localfoodeconomics.com, and we're really excited in that we have partnered with the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development, and we're sponsoring a special issue in that journal for a call for papers of communities that have undertaken best practices in evaluating how how local food projects have impacted the community. So we would love to see some really good case studies on farm to school to the extent that they're out there. Next slide, please. So the toolkit is broken into 2 sets of modules, and we can just have all 4 of these show up at once. And the first set of modules really get into issues about framing an economic impact assessment process and engaging stakeholders. There's also modules on using secondary and primary data. And then the second set of modules, if we move on to the next slide, relate to how to undertake input-output analysis, what is input-output analysis, how do you measure countervailing effects, and then really talking about how to use a particular software program, sort of an off-the-shelf software program from input-output analysis called Input. So next slide, please. So I guess that wraps up my set of slides here, and I will turn it over to Todd.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Welcome, everybody. My name is Todd Schmidt. I'm associate professor at Cornell University, and I want to talk a little bit about another guide or resource for you as you think about conducting your own types of economic impact assessments in this farm to school world. Next slide, please. I don't have a pretty picture, but here is a citation for it and the links. What this is a practitioner's guide to conducting an economic impact assessment of regional food hubs using IMPLAN. For those not familiar with IMPLAN, IMPLAN provides both software and very detailed data at the national, state, county, local level surrounding 500 plus industry sectors in the economy and their purchasing and sales patterns that exist among them. This document was done with a co-op agreement with AMS as well that was really looking for recommending procedures to assess impacts for emerging or existing food hubs. It is available on the AMS site as well as on our extension site at Dyson. And importantly, what it has is it includes a downloadable Excel companion file that allows you to look step by step through the process that we recommend, through the example that we give in the guide, and then also as a template for you to use in your own efforts. Next slide, please. So you might be asking why I was asked to be on this webinar for Farm to School when the P Guide talks about food hubs. And the general point is, what I'm here to do is talk about ways to think about or recommended ways to do things right, to get your impacts right. While we talk about food hubs in the P Guide, the general approach that we advise is adaptable to all sorts of scenarios. In a lot of ways, you can replace food hub with farm to school, and you're good to go. Ultimately, the case is if you can understand the spending patterns of the entities you're examining, whether they be food hubs, whether they be farm to school programs, you can get a long ways in estimating impact. The guide talks about things about creating new sectors, which is important in refining impact if you're dealing with a particular set of producers or firms within an industry, for example, scale-specific differences. But the point of my involvement in the webinar today is to sort of take the P Guide and think about some alternative pathways for farm to school assessments that may be relevant to the work that you're doing. And in large part, highlighting the types of data and skills that are required to do these types of studies. Next slide, please. Similar to sort of the toolkit modules that Jeff just talked about, the P Guide walks you through from defining the study area you talk to, through Food Hub transactions, data collection, to actually constructing the model in InPlan, how you set up an analysis, and how you interpret the results. So it really walks you through the entire process. Next slide, please. One of the main points of this P-Guide is recommending this process where you actually open your models in the InPlan software, close them out, open them in Microsoft Access, open them again in InPlan. It's technically demanding, but it's not rocket science. And the whole point is trying to get InPlan to do what you want it to do. When you're creating new sectors in InPlan, for example, you can't within InPlan itself get institutional demands for those products. Think household demands for farm products correct, partly because in creating a new sector, you actually have to use an existing quote unquote empty sector. And this empty sector rears its head in some problematic ways, hence going through this iterative process. Ultimately, the point is to get everything right, imports, exports, local supply and demand conditions right, and keeping them right through the process of customizing your model in InPlan. Next slide, please. So again, the main thrust of the P-Guide, which has many applications for farm to school efforts, is to get your impacts right. I put this visually in a way of thinking of a beleaguered Todd on the right and his battle with the empty tobacco sector in InPlan. So, okay, next slide. So let me just go through a few examples. I haven't done a farm to school impact analysis itself, but I've derived some scenarios for farm to school, some specific scenarios, and I want to identify the ways that the P-Guide can help. So take, for example, school districts in a 6-county region that want to shift 25% of their current food purchases from distributors and manufacturers to fresh fruits and vegetables from local farms. Okay, very farm to school relevant. The P-Guide can help you construct the region, your local region, for analysis within InPlan, and then help you identify what are the industries of importance to this scenario, okay? In this case, we're thinking about purchases of fresh fruits and vegetables from farms. That would be industries 3 and 4 in InPlan. And let's assume for now that the spending patterns existing in the default InPlan data are reasonable to your analysis. You also need to identify the sectors from which the school is purchasing these food products now. In this case, it would be 81, fruit and vegetable manufacturing, and wholesale trade, where food distributors and things would reside. Finally, and let's just assume that those spending patterns for those are reasonably represented in the existing InPlan data. Finally, you think about the schools themselves. Well, guess what? InPlan, Industry 472, is elementary and secondary schools. There is an existing spending pattern for that industry. So for the sake of argument, let's assume that that's okay, except for the shifts, ultimately, right, of purchases from distributors and manufacturers to fruit and vegetable farms in the local area. In this case, you would adjust these spending patterns of the school industry, 472, that decrease purchases in 81 and 395 and increase those in 3 and 4, right? There's technical things involved in that that are described in the detail to help you do that. But ultimately, what you end up with is 2 model InPlan models, one sort of default and one that you've now customized. You can look at the level of those expended purchases and compare the differences in impacts from across those 2 models. There's several considerations that are highlighted in the P-Guide that would consider things that, well, how much of those purchases from manufacturers and distributors are already local? Do you have specific school data that can help you update your InPlan model coefficients? Also, If those farms purchase or sell more to schools, are they expanding their operations or selling less, for example, at a farmer's market? That has differences in impacts. Finally, if the school is ultimately going to pay more than they would have through alternative to their existing alternatives, how is that funded? Do the schools spend less in other areas, or do ultimately they have to raise tax revenues from households? If so, then you need to account for that negative impact from the consequence of the tax. Next slide. The P Guide can walk you through that from the context of food hubs, just replace it with farm to school. Now, take that same example and instead think about their dedicated focus to small scale producers, okay? So everything as in the first example is the same, but now since your focus is on smaller scale producers, the industry sectors for fruit and vegetables, 3 and 4, probably are not representative of the target group for that school. In this case, using advice from the P Guide, you can collect financial data from these farms, create a new sector that identifies its purchases and sales patterns, as well as adjustments in other sectors that would purchase from this new sector as well. So now you can do the same application of model scenarios, but with more informed data that's specific to the farms that will be affected in your analysis. Next slide. Example number 3. Let's look now in the case of school districts, say in New York State, that purchase fresh fruit and vegetables from California 6 months out of the year, okay? These are leakages to the New York economy, don't contribute to impact. But our governor, this is all hypothetical, just approved a program allocating $5 million in grants to fruit and vegetable producers in New York to adopt season extension technologies and thereby reduce these non-local purchases by schools in half. Can you use the P Guide to help you construct model scenarios for this? Of course, but what do you need to know? Okay, certainly if farms are going to adopt new practices, that means their spending pattern, their production function will change. So the P Guide can help you either adapt existing sectors or create new sectors, okay? In this case, since the funding is to apply expansion in operations, we can think about expanded sales only. There's none of those other offsets, okay? Just as in examples 1 and 2, you can think about what farms are affected and whether you need to create a new sector or not. But ultimately, with your school industry, with either the default in-plan data or specific spending patterns, you can now edit the local purchase percentages of that school higher because of the increased production that you've already modeled in the farm production sectors. Again, you can change these different models to reflect the differences in demand by those industries. Again, we're talking about $5 million in state level funding. How that is supported, either through taxes or reduced spending elsewhere, would be important in your estimation. And the P Guide talks through all these things. Last slide, please. Now take that same example that we just did, but now we're going to focus on New York City only school districts, okay? Everything else is the same. So here the question becomes, is the average spending pattern in plan for schools for New York State representative for those just in New York City? Is it ultimately good enough, okay? Probably not, but that's fine. If you follow the P Guide, where we used a procedure called analysis by parts, if you have the spending patterns for New York City schools, you can simply enter those into your model and do the same analysis. That's all analysis by parts is. But it requires additional data and those requirements are described in the P Guide. Last slide. The main point of me being on this webinar was to provide you with a resource that talks about getting things right, okay? And it's just, I'd like to emphasize that constructing these types of scenarios takes time and a lot of thought to make sure all of the effects, both positive and negative, are accounted for. Whether you're doing the work yourself or hiring someone to do it, the assumptions need to be clear, defendable, and documented. Really, there's no silver bullet. As you can imagine, many situations are very case specific in what's happening in the local economy. But we think this publication can be a useful guide, or shall I say, P-guide. Really, it talks about how to collect the right kind of data, making sure InPlan's doing what you want it to do, and you understand the outputs that it gives you. Lastly, you need to be realistic in doing these types of analysis, right? Everybody needs to understand what needs to be done up front, and then you need to compare that with your team's intellectual capacity. If it's beyond your capacity and you look to commission a study to do this, you still need to understand what it is you're asking for and what the deliverables are from the people that you're asking to do the work. And with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd. That was a really great introduction for what I'll be talking about. What my presentation is, my name is Libby Christensen, by the way. I'm a postdoc here at Colorado State University. And along with my co-authors, we wrote a report on the economic impacts of farm to school and essentially took those two resources that we just heard about, the AMS Toolkit as well as the Cornell P-Guide, and really tried to apply it to the farm to school case. And so what we created, just released in September, was a resource that is available on the National Farm to School website, and goes through step by step many of the things that Todd just discussed and really applied it to the farm to school case. And I want to acknowledge that it wouldn't have been possible without our peer reviewers and our data collection team, some of which I know are on the call, so thank you very much, as well as our funders, AgriBank as well as CoBank. And the goal for the study was really to develop and apply a standardized, replicable framework to assess the local economic impact of a school's or district's shift to local food procurement using primary and secondary data. And you might ask yourself, why do we focus on procurement? And what, as Anupama said, there are kind of three activities that are associated with farm to school. We've got education and school gardens as well as procurement. And looking at the farm to school census, procurement is the most popular of all activities. So 92% of districts that have farm to school active in their district are engaging in procurement. And so that is local foods that they serve in their cafeterias or in their after school programs or as part of a smart snack. And so we decided to really focus on this one. It also has the strongest linkages with local communities as well as producers. So we really wanted to expand and explore those really interesting connections and relationships. Going forward, I think as kind of both Jeff and Todd mentioned, there's really important that we think about good data. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some good data sources as well as some sound assumptions that are required in building these models. As Todd mentioned, many people that are conducting economic impacts use InPlan, and part of this is because of its ease of use. Once you kind of learn it, there's a steep learning curve, but once you know it, it's a pretty useful tool, pretty easy to use. And the data sources that are in there come primarily from national sources like the BEA as well as the Ag Census. And also they break down agriculture into 14 different sectors. But as kind of Todd mentioned, the spending patterns that are represented in that model are oftentimes influenced by those producers that account for the largest percent of sales. So if you think about who's kind of dictating vegetable production in the United States, who's really doing the largest percent of sales, we have these kind of really big operations. Here's an example of a photo from California. They're oftentimes heavily mechanized. They are quite large operations. And if we think about those farmers that are selling to school districts, oftentimes we think of kind of these much smaller, mid-sized farms that farm to school sales are just incorporated into their larger portfolio of direct sales, say farmers markets, community supported agriculture. And so it's important to recognize that the spending patterns of these two operations are very different. And we're definitely not making a value judgment here saying one is better than the other, but just recognizing if we're interested in understanding the economic impact of farm to school, we have to account and really emphasize the differences in those spending patterns. So what is required is we create a new sector, as Todd mentioned, specifically for those producers that are selling to school districts that are geographically closer to the school. And so one of our challenges is how do we populate and better understand those spending patterns? And anyone that has worked with farmers understands that collecting financial data can oftentimes be very difficult. And so what we try to do is do as much background and our own homework before getting out into the field and talking to farmers so that we could use their time most wisely. And so what we did is utilize some really great new resources that are available. So we've got the NASS Local Food Survey, we've got the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, which provides the most detailed financial data for farms, as well as the Farm to School Census to really do our homework on our end so that we could efficiently use the time of farmers. So for this project, we use the ARMS as well as the Farm to School Census to help us triangulate that. And so as I said, the ARMS data is really great in terms of its ability to provide us financial data from farms. Unfortunately, a lot of that data is restricted access. And so what my colleagues here at Colorado State have done is broken that data down into really useful metrics to create benchmarks for those farmers that potentially are, or those farmers that are selling locally. So here we've got the breakdown of all variable expenditures for farmers that are selling locally and those that are not selling locally. And what we see kind of as our example of the tomato farmers would indicate is that the labor accounts for a much larger percent for local producers as compared to non-local food producers. So this is at least a starting point, a place to start thinking about how your farmers that are selling to the schools may be different than what's currently populated in plan. So we use this data for developing our survey. It's also kind of in addition to good data and making sure that these models are as accurate as possible, it's important to recognize sound assumptions. And here I mean specifically making sure that we're capturing the net impact and not the gross impact. One example here would be if a school starts purchasing directly from farmers to increase their local food procurement, what impact will that have on the intermediaries in the area? And here we're only specifically interested in the intermediaries within the region that we define, but it's important to take into consideration and ask yourself when you're building your model, because it wouldn't be accurate to just say all of these the growth in sales is just pure positive. There's going to be some other trade-offs that occur within on both the supply and the demand side. So moving specifically to the report that we developed and thinking through how to apply all of this kind of really useful tools that have been developed for doing economic impacts of food systems studies, we went to the census and we saw that kind of while there's a lot of great studies that are out there that assess the economic impact of farm to school, most of them focus on direct transactions. So they're looking exclusively at farmers directly selling to schools. But what we see from the census is, in fact, many of the local food purchases are going through an intermediary still. And so we had to think about how do we adapt our survey protocol to capture that and think about that as part of our model as well. So what we ended up doing was we developed a survey with 20 questions, and while we included some kind of general questions about satisfaction, we really tried to focus in on those 6 expenditure categories that make up the largest percent of the spending patterns for these kind of local producers. And that was kind of our strategy in making sure that we use the farmers' time efficiently. We also pilot tested the tool with a number of stakeholders across the country. And that protocol is going to be available to all of you on the National Farm to School website, as well as another website that we'll provide links later on in the presentation for. But we really see this as a tool to be used elsewhere. And what we did is we wanted to make sure that the tool was useful in achieving the goals that we set forth. So we ended up doing 2 case studies, one in Georgia and one in Minneapolis, to see how we could use this information to develop our economic impact. So here I'm just going to go into the Minneapolis case study, and if you want to look for more detail, that's available in the report as well. So here, talking about how do we define our region, we focused on the Minneapolis School District, which is represented by that red square thing in the center, and then looked at their response to the census on how they define local. And so they used a definition of 200 miles. So we drew a circle around the school district and used that to think about where are these farmers located. And then we partnered with our National Farm to School Network to actually go out on the ground and collect data, because it's so important that you have relationships with farmers before you start collecting this information, because it's pretty sensitive information. So the green dots represent the farmers that we surveyed. And then based on their responses and the school district's response to the census, we are able to estimate that there are 32 farmers selling to the Minneapolis School District. So we use that information to further to develop our economic impact model. Using those survey responses, we were able to create a new sector for farm to school producers and compare that to the existing in-plan fruit and vegetable sector. So we took fruit and vegetable and aggregated, which is available, details are available in the report. And we're able to compare the expenditure patterns of those two operations, or those two sectors. And once again, as we see that labor once again constitutes a larger percent of those variable expenditures. And in addition to finding out what farmers are spending their money on, it's really important to find out where they're making those purchases. So what we found is similar to other studies that local food producers oftentimes have stronger linkages to their regional economy, that the farmers in our case study actually purchase more of their inputs locally. So every $100 that they spent on inputs, $82 stays within the Minneapolis 200-mile radius, versus $700 or $70 for non-farm to school producers. Another interesting finding, and kind of different from previous economic impact assessments, is that it was important to think about how farm to school fits into the general sales portfolio of these producers. So farm to school sales accounted for a very small percent of these farmers' total sales, only 7%. But some of their intermediated sales were also going to school districts. So we had to think about how do you model the direct sales as well as the intermediated sales, and there's differences there. It was also, we captured in our survey some of the non-quantitative benefits that farmers found to selling to schools. So oftentimes it was a new market for seconds that they couldn't sell at the farmer's market or in a CSA. They valued a lot the education opportunities for engaging young people in agriculture, and also potentially finding new clients by feeding a child, and that child goes and talks to their parents to encourage them to buy products from that farm. So our final results was that the economic output multiplier for the Minneapolis public schools was 1.45. This is in line with previous studies, and essentially what it means is that for every additional dollar that the school district spends on buying local products, another 45 cents circulates in that regional economy. And so that's kind of, if you want to boil it down and try and communicate that value to the audience that you're looking at. So in conclusion, this report really complements both the toolkit that Jeff went over as well as the P-Guide, and provides an approach for data collection and modeling using primary and secondary data that really focuses on farm to school and the unique attributes around farm to school that accounts for both farmers and their supply chains and opportunity costs. And just to conclude, I really want to stress that we as here at Colorado State can't go everywhere and collect all of our data. And so we see this as a real tool that we want you to use. And so that's why we're making the protocol available to everyone. And that our email addresses are available at the end of the presentation. And so if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. Our goal is to be able to collect this data in multiple locations to be able to do some real valuable and interesting cross comparisons. So with that, I will hand it off to Becca. Thank you guys very much.
All right, thanks, Libby. Well, fortunately for us, we had the opportunity to partner with the National Farm to School Network on that economic impact assessment, and sort of think about that as a pilot project for our larger project we just got funded by the USDA National Institute for Food and Agriculture that looks more comprehensively at some of the economic implications of farm to school beyond sort of the economic impact assessment framework. Next slide, please. So we have a pretty fantastic interdisciplinary team here, if I do say so myself. So you can see the members of our CSU team. These are people from the Department of Ag and Resource Economics, as well as the Department of Food Science, Human Nutrition. And then we've just assembled really a wonderful team of partners from many different USDA agencies you can see here, as well as E-Extension. And then we have some of our local Colorado school districts that you'll see we're going to be working with on a specific aspect of the project. But one nice thing about having these partners, both from the National Farm to School Network as well as the USDA, is that we're really trying to take advantage of as many secondary data sources as we can. As Libby explained, there's really been a proliferation of data in this space, so we really want to use that as much as possible. Next slide, please. We also have a wonderful advisory team that I just wanted to give credit to and is helping to guide this project. Next slide, please. So our research question is, what are the impacts of farm-to-school programs on farmers and food supply chain businesses, household consumption patterns, and school food choice, consumption, and food plate waste? So big task here. And for that, we have 4 primary objectives. Next slide, please. The first is to evaluate if farm-to-school programs result in increased market access and profitability outcomes for farmers and food supply chain businesses. Given new data that's available both through the USDA ARMS, the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, as well as that local food survey that Libby mentioned, we can now actually do some more disaggregation of people who are selling, farmers and ranchers that are selling through farm to school programs, as well as try to get at some of the intermediated businesses that may be created or expanded or have changes based on farm to school. So we really want to dig deep into understanding, does farm to school really create new markets for participants, both at the farm gate as well as throughout the supply chain? Next slide, please. Secondly, we're going to explore geographic and intertemporal patterns in U.S. households' food demand and consumption to assess whether farm-to-school programs are correlated with changes in the purchased amounts of recommended foods at home. What does that actually mean in the non-academic lingo? Well, one of the benefits, the purported benefits of farm-to-school is that as you increase healthy food that's available within schools, that's hopefully going to change what kids are actually consuming, right? That they may consume more fruits and vegetables or whole grains, and that they actually then go home and ask their parents to purchase those at the local grocery store. If this happens, we should actually see changes in what households are purchasing in those grocery stores, right? To hopefully be more in line with the recommended consumption of certain kinds of food groups. And so using some secondary data that's available, we can actually match the farm to school census with something called IRI data and actually start to look at that, which is really pretty cool. Next slide, please. Objective 3, we're going to pilot in-school experiments to assess how specific farm-to-school programs influence food choice, consumption, and food plate waste. Now, for this piece, there's really not secondary data that's available, unfortunately. So what we're going to have to do is actually pilot this project or this objective in 3 local school districts, right, where we can see how some kind of intervention actually changes what students eat, and therefore how much plate waste actually occurs. And we're working very closely, as I said, with our Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition on this, as well as these 3 school districts who've provided excellent partnerships. And our hope is that depending on what we find here, that this is the kind of assessment then that can be expanded into other regions. Next slide, please. And finally, with these 3 pieces, we know that doing the research is important, but equally important is making sure that it's actually useful and disseminated to the people who are making these decisions and the people who work in farm-to-school programs. And so we're going to make sure to do a really good job partnering with the National Farm to School Network, with the National Farm to Cafeteria Conference, where we will be available to answer questions, as well as with the USDA, the various agencies we're working with, and through the E-Extension Community of Practice on the economic impacts of local and regional food systems that Dawn is going to talk about here next.
So this is Dawn McFadden again, and we wanted to wrap up today's webinar, as I said, making this more of a start of a conversation than you telling us what we're doing. We want us to actually start becoming a community practice so we know what everyone is doing. So next slide. One way we have decided to try to take this on is with the permission of Kathleen Lang, who runs the broader community, local, regional, and food systems committee of the extension. We asked to make a subcommittee on local food economics. And what you see here is a page that we have developed, which will become kind of the mothership for this set of projects. So as you all have heard and know, it really was spearheaded by and started with the efforts of the Toolkit team that the USDA Ag Marketing Service started. But what we've done is we've reformulated that page so that it now includes a broader set of projects that may link directly to the Toolkit, but might also just be looking at other economic aspects of local foods. So if you were to visit Local Food Economics right now, this is the set of projects that you would see links to, so you could get more information on them. Some of them near the end of their project, some of them just beginning. But what we like to highlight is obviously this farm to school work you've seen pieces of today. You can get more information on, and this webinar link eventually after today. But we invite you to visit that site just to see all of the projects that are there. Next slide. And more importantly, we ask that you can submit your own project. This is a very specific invitation and screen that you'd see in the Toolkit part of that page, where we're asking for people to tell us how they're using the Toolkit. But more broadly than that, we also make an invitation for you to bring your broader project, whether it is or is not connected to the Toolkit as well. And I'll show you how you submit those here in a little bit. Next slide. So if you want to go to the Local Food Economics, and there's a place that you can connect up in the right-hand side of that menu, you will get a link just like this where you can actually nominate any work you're doing on the economics of local foods. And yes, we know there's a whole lot of benefits of local foods, but for this subcommittee and what we manage, we want it to be something to do with the economics or management aspects of local foods. You would just give us some information and we would figure out how we could best integrate your work into our new community practice. Thank you. Next slide. And lastly, just to reiterate something that Jeff has already mentioned, our very newest effort is a special issue we're putting together in cooperation with the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. This is the first announcement of it today, but what we're looking for is abstracts by November 30th with the pretty ambitious goal to have this turned around and this issue out by early next fall of 2018. If you're willing to follow our timeline and kind of the template and format that we're following, and more information is both available at that QR code in the slide, and if you visit the Local Food Economics website, or if you visit the foodsystemsjournal.org website. We have it lots of places. Next slide. Just to give you some motivation to maybe join our community practice, just in the time that we've actually been having that page more focused on the toolkit and activities directly related to it, we've been really successful in getting a lot of users driven to the site, and that is with just one relatively straightforward project. As we get linkages with these other projects that might have followers or people interested in, for instance, farm to school or rural urban linkages and wealth creation, we hope to expand those numbers in the future with your help. Next slide. And so again, we not only have a way that you can participate by nominating your project, but if you're right now just wanting to be a follower who gets updates on all of the projects that will come online, and so that you can stay in touch to learn about things like this webinar, and you also can just sign up individually to be on a listserv. We've been limiting that listserv to 1 email a month, mostly promoting things like this webinar, and that will make you individual part of the community of practice even if you don't have an active project right now. Next slide. And again, we're also trying to make this very active and a way to build community through social media. So you'll see we both have a Twitter feed and a Facebook page where we try to both highlight programs going on and where you yourself can post things that the community might want to know about. Next slide. And so now I'll wrap up with moving back up from the community practice to what are the next steps for this project. As Becca kind of mentioned, they hope to extend the recent report from the National Farm to School Network by doing even more ongoing applied research with the Farm to School grant that the CSU project secured resources for. Alongside that, we want to elevate the community of practice. It's certainly now going to be the place to find the most recent information on the economics of farm to school. But as I showed you, we're hoping to have a myriad of projects there that you can stay in touch with. And either you yourself, or if you want to nominate other projects or people, please help connect us with people who will be important and vital parts of this community practice. Next slide. And we did want to give you a set of resources and names that you can contact for more information on anything you heard today. So I won't stay on the slide very long, but it'll be embedded when we post this webinar so that you can go back and look for those names. Next slide. So although we hope to leave a little bit more time, we do still have some time for those of you who can stay for questions. And at this time, I think that the chat box is how we plan to use it, because I think we have most participants muted. I might throw it back over to the Fort Collins people to manage the questions. It looks like Todd already pointed out that we have a typo in his email address. We'll try to get that corrected before we post this webinar for the public.
There you go.
Okay, is there, it looks like we have someone who raised their hand. Holly? Do you want to, can you type your message in the chat box, please, or your question in the chat box?
I'm going to change that from all panelists to
Oh, everybody.
Also, yes. Oh, sorry, she said she's not ready. Okay. Can we turn on her audio, Darren?
no, not on
Okay.
the webinar.
I apologize, Holly. We can't turn on your
Audio.
audio, so you're going to have to talk in here
Or just type.
Type into the chat.
type in the chat box. Okay, well, I think since we're not seeing any questions, as Libby said, our email addresses are at the end. Todd's is written incorrectly. His is tms1@cornell.edu. Oh, I'm sorry. So Holly said she just wondered if we could say more about our next steps as participants. Restate briefly. Well, I will say in terms of the report that, as Libby mentioned, you know, there's a survey instrument that's provided there. It is certainly the hope of this team that people will go out and actually use that survey instrument, as well as the methodological tools provided here with the AMS Economic Impact Assessment Toolkit, with Todd's P-Guide, as well as this new National Farm to School led report. And that hopefully that gives you the tools you need to actually do some rigorous evaluation of the economic impacts of your farm to school program. And I will say that, you know, if there are specific questions that come up, Libby's email address is at the end there. My email address is at the end there. Please feel free to reach out to us. We can't do the assessment for you, but we can try to troubleshoot if there are particular questions, and others can do the same with those other reports. And then also that community of practice that Dawn spent some time talking about is a great place to kind of crowdsource information. There's a listserv there that has a really great group of practitioners as well as researchers from across the country. And so we encourage you to use that and ask questions, and hopefully that provides you some concrete next steps moving forward. Anupama, is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that sounds great. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, so what we'll do is for everybody who registered for the webinar today, since we have recorded it, we will make sure to send you out a link to the recording, as well as more information for all of the resources that were listed today. Thank you so much for joining. We'll also be sending out blasts immediately following this about the special issue for the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development special issue. Thank you very much, everybody.